Good evening. Thank you, Joan. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's public affairs program. Today's a very special evening for many reasons, including the little game that's happening down in South Philadelphia. We appreciate you all being here. And being at our very special public affairs program. As you know, the Legacy Foundation cares for the great collections. We have scholarships, lecture programs like tonight, exhibits, tours. We do all kinds of programs throughout the year, all using the values of this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia. And the first line in our bylaws, every member shall support the Constitution and the free enterprise system. What we're focusing on more and more is civics education. That is going to be our focus moving forward. All that we do, including tonight's lecture, all of those things I listed are made possible through voluntary contributions, mostly through members, like many of you. So we look forward to your continued support, and we thank you for your support. It is why we are here. A few housekeeping items. Tonight, first of all, please silence your cell phones. I know a few of you might want to check now and then. If you do that, please make sure it's quiet. We will have a Q&A tonight. We'll do that through cards. There should be some cards on the seats, and staff will come around and collect them. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. We will end promptly at 7:30 for many logisticals and traffic reasons that you can well imagine. I'd ask that you all stay in the room until our guests have exited Lincoln Hall, though, at the end of the program. Our next program is really a special one. November 1st, Ron White. You may remember Professor White came on the 200th anniversary of Ulysses S. Grant, his birthday. And it was a wonderful talk. His brand new book is On Great Fields, The Life and Heroism of Joshua Chamberlain. It promises to be a great program on November 1st. So all that we do is made possible through leadership and generosity. There's no greater leader and no one more generous than the chair of our education committee, who will now introduce our program, Mr. Steve Target. Steve.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers this evening, General David Petraeus and Professor Lord Andrew Roberts. General Petraeus is one of the most prominent analysts for contemporary security issues, military developments, and global affairs, with 37 years of service in the Army. Petraeus' career includes 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat, including in command of the surge in Iraq, U.S. Central Command, and the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan. He then served as director of our CIA. General Petraeus also has been awarded the Lincoln Award here at the Union League. Professor Roberts is a biographer and a historian whose 20 books include the bestsellers Churchill, Walking with Destiny, Napoleon, A Life. He's also written the prize-winning Masters and Commanders, The Storm of War, Salisbury, Victorian Titan, and The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. Professor Lord Roberts is a fellow at the Royal Society of Literature and Royal Historical Society, and is the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow and the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And facilitating our discussion this evening is Carol Raleigh Flynn. Ms. Flynn is the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a 30-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. Ms. Flynn has held senior executive positions, including the director of the CIA's Leadership Academy, director of the Office of Foreign Intelligence Relationships, executive director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, and the chief of station in major posts in Southeast Asia and Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, please help us welcome General Petraeus, Professor Roberts, and Kelly Raleigh.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and it's truly an honor to be here tonight with General Petraeus and Professor Roberts. to talk about what I think is a really great book, Conflict, Evolution of Warfare from 1045 to Ukraine. This book.
1945.
Oh, excuse me.
You said earlier this morning.
Dear.
It's big enough as it is. Not to worry.
Just checking to see if you were listening. Anyway, it's an extremely ambitious book to cover all these conflicts since 1945. Not all of them. There were some 140, but they've covered at least 24 of them. And as I was reading it, and it is a terrific read, as I was reading it, I was wondering, why did you decide to do this? And also the timing. Why now? So, Professor.
Thank you. We decided to do it because just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we very much felt that it was a good idea to have a book that placed that war in its military history context, not just in its geopolitical and political context. And David immediately jumped at the idea. And so we got on to HarperCollins, the publishers. They asked us how we were going to divvy up the chapters. And I said, well, David's going to write about all the countries he's invaded. And he also wrote about Vietnam, obviously the absolute crucial chapter in the book. And I was going to fill in the rest. And what happened was we essentially sent each other's chapters backwards and forwards in what turned out ultimately to be literally thousands of emails. And it was the most profoundly intellectually stimulating experience for me, certainly.
And it was really very enjoyable for me. I've known Andrew and admired him for a very long time, prodigious historian and biographer, the best single volume on Winston Churchill. In fact, we did 5 events together on that. I was interviewing him in that case on the stage of the New York Historical Society. He had invited me to the Clifton Literary Festival, even though I hadn't written a book yet. He said, don't worry, you'll fill the tent. That's what this is all about. And then a number of others, including one that was particularly delightful. Again, his book about the last king of America, which we did at the Army Museum in London, helping them raise money in the Army Benevolent Fund. And I said, why don't you ask me the question, a series of questions. Could the British have won the American Revolutionary War? The answer to that, in case you're wondering, is yes, if they'd had a competent civil military counterinsurgency campaign, which they did not. But by the way, let me just start off by saying how great it is, really, first and foremost, to be back here. As you noted kindly, I did come here when I was a 4-star general and received the Lincoln Award, very memorable and enjoyable event. And was back here again, I think for your military affairs or defense committee or something, perhaps around Veterans Day. And this is a truly great club, and it's gotten even greater since I was first here back in 2009 or 10. I just can't believe a club could own 3 golf courses. Again, keep in mind, this is not a golf club. It's not a country club. And I'm trying to get my head around that. A beach club and restaurants all over the place as well. This is really quite extraordinary. I mean, I'm a partner now. So for the last 10 years, I've been at KKR, as one of the largest investment firms in the world. Particularly good period, by the way. We've gone from 83 billion to 520 billion during that time. Nice time to be a partner. I'm trying to figure out how to buy this place. I mean, we want to be your strategic partner. And then, just finally, as before we get back to serious stuff, I'm trying to process this whole thing that we have a room of maybe as many as 400 people or so. We were afraid it would be down to 200 given the other option in town tonight. And I'm not sure what that says about all of us. I mean, maybe we should have canceled the event and done it at the ballpark.
Yeah. Your book talks a lot about strategic leadership. It looks at these various conflicts through the optic of strategic leadership. And would you care to talk a little bit about how you see strategic leadership?
Yeah. So when I was between the 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, I actually sought to distill an intellectual construct that would enable me. I was told I was very likely going to go back to Iraq. I ended up going 6 months sooner than I thought, but because the situation deteriorated very alarmingly in late 2006. But the construct has it that a strategic leader, and this is so it'd be the president in certain cases, but then it's very quickly the battlefield commander, has to perform 4 tasks very, very well if you want to have a chance at succeeding. You have to get the big ideas right, the overarching strategy that requires a real nuanced understanding of the objective factors of the battlefield, your strengths and weaknesses, the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, the physical terrain, the human terrain, all aspects of the culture, society, religion, makeup, and so forth. You then have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of your organization and, frankly, to everyone else who has a stake in the success of the particular campaign. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the example that you provide. It's the energy, the inspiration. It's how you spend your time. It's a crucial component. We had a very detailed battle rhythm, my schedule of recurring events, stuff you did every day of the week. It's a 7-day-a-week endeavor after all combat, a couple of times a week, once a week, and so forth on. But also it's the metrics, and they have to mean something. They have to be absolutely rigorously developed, rigorously reported, deconflicted. It can't become like the body count in Vietnam, which is both the wrong metric and then led to major integrity problems that many in the chain of command were aware of, but did not fully rectify. And then you have to sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas to do it again and again and again. For what it's worth, this works in the business world. It works for every leader at every level, has to perform these. The critical component of strategic leadership, though, is that the person at the very top has to get the big ideas right above all. If you don't get that strategy right, it doesn't matter how charismatic, how inspirational, how energetic, determined, forthright, all the other qualities we seek in leaders, you've got to get that right. And in fact, people used to ask me, what is it you look for? Say when I was commanding the surge in that 3-star operational commander, and they said they knew I was a big runner, and we ran in combat, by the way. We still managed to fit it in, but I'd bring captains in so that I could tap into them while they were doing that. Plus, they could also keep up. The generals cannot. But they said, what do you look for in this 3-star? And they say, is it somebody who can run with you? I said, gosh, no. Did you see the 3-star? They're both of the 3-stars during the surge were very substantial football players. Lloyd Austin, now our Secretary of Defense, was the second one. Ray Odierno, our Chief of Staff. I said, what I'm after, we're looking for, what we need is operational judgment. Again, can he get the big ideas right at his level, with me getting them right at the strategic level, and then all the way down? This is absolutely crucial. And the book is full of cases where individuals performed superb strategic leadership, and often the outcome was positive for that side. And then a number of cases where we didn't get the big ideas right. You think of a particularly bad big idea. Remember the French in Indochina at that time, Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia, and they're very frustrated. They can't get the communists to join them in battle. They're thrashing around the jungle, and the communists are guerrilla and irregular fighters. So they decide, what we're going to do? We'll establish a big base way out into the countryside. This place called Dien Bien Phu looks pretty good. And by the way, they even have 5 little outposts outside, and as only the French could do, they were named for the 5 mistresses of the commander. But they figure we'll make this really attractive. It'll have a magnetic pull for them, and they're finally going to come to battle. Did they ever? Obviously, the French ended up surrendering, going into captivity. Eventually, there was an agreement in Geneva that partitioned North and South Vietnam. That was a seriously bad big idea. But frankly, we did not get the big ideas right until arguably 1968. That's over 10 years into our involvement in what really actually still is the longest war. People say Afghanistan, 20 years. Vietnam, if you start in 1955, 56, and take it all the way to 73, 74, again, much longer. So again, this component of conflict is absolutely central. It's critical. And as we went through and did these various chapters, we realized it kept becoming more and more pronounced. We went back and rewrote the introduction to very explicitly lay out this particular intellectual construct for a strategic leader. By the way, the president of your club, where is he, by the way? Did he? Oh, he might be watching the Phillies. He snuck off after introducing me to half the people in the room. But, he laid out his business. He is a strategic leader. He gets the big ideas right. Again, we're trying to figure out how to buy his organization too. Please.
Thank you. As I mentioned, you cover more than 24 conflicts. How did you pick and choose which conflicts to talk about? And were there any runner-ups that didn't quite make the cut?
There were plenty of runner-ups, but the criterion was very much those wars that were paradigm shifts in the concept of the evolution of warfare. So we look at wars that were fought in jungles and in deserts, big wars, small wars, wars that were across border and counterinsurgency and so on. And of the 140 or so wars, major wars that have taken place since 1945, we chose those particular 24 because they told us something special. A couple that would leap out, for example, would be the Yom Kippur War, which started, of course, with the Egyptian surprise attack, and which looked as though at one point it could become an existential crisis for Israel. Then was turned back, not least, by the way, because of the use of anti-tank weaponry and new anti-tank weaponry. And we're always looking in this book about new weaponry. And then it was turned back. And within 3 weeks, actually, the Israeli armies were within the really distance of hitting both Damascus and Cairo. And one of the things actually we learned in that was that war isn't linear, a very important concept, and also that the tank, which can be, at the beginning of that war, people were asking whether or not the tank had any future because of the way in which these various anti-missile, anti-tank weaponry was used. And of course, later on, it actually was used by Ariel Sharon to surround the Egyptian Third Army. And there was a great line from an American general who said that the tank is a little bit like a dinner jacket in that you don't need it very often, but when you do, nothing else will do.
It's a great line. The book also talks quite a bit about counterinsurgency from post-colonial wars to more recent. Would you like to talk about counterinsurgency wars and maybe?
I thought you'd never ask. Yeah, and these have been very substantial. Obviously, we have very recent history. I was privileged to command both of the wars at their height in Iraq and Afghanistan. By the way, the truth is I was looking for an opportunity to write about those two in particular, but I didn't want to write a tell-all. There were huge advances offered if I'd do a memoir that was a tell-all. I just didn't think that that was appropriate. I think they're often unkind and uncharitable. So that was yet another reason. And I should point out, by the way, Lord Roberts was not Lord Roberts when I signed on. He was a mere award-winning historian. So I don't want you to think, I'm a one of these royal groupies or something like that. But I should tell you that, so he is Baron Roberts of Belgravia and in the House of Lords. I do very much love going to his beautiful white townhouse in Belgravia for dinner, where we talk about the needs of his very needy constituents. For those of you who know Belgravia, I mean, they're not needy at all. There is one problem though, and that is that about the third of his neighborhood hasn't been back there, curiously, since the Russians invaded Ukraine. But no, the counterinsurgency component, it just happened. That's something I was fascinated with all the time that I was going through the Army, even when I was serving out in the Cold War in Germany. And lo and behold, that study paid off. And I recognize, for example, early on as a two-star in Iraq, we didn't even have a field manual for this. Essentially, I wrote my dissertation at Princeton, in fact, for a PhD there on the U.S. Army and U.S. military and the lessons of Vietnam. So we had basically consigned counterinsurgency or regular warfare to the ash heaps of history. We wanted to have nothing to do with it again. And I actually noted in my dissertation that, you don't always get to choose the wars you fight. And it might be that you actually should retain some expertise and experience. That really was not what we did do. And lo and behold, there was a moment where I came back from the three-star tour in Iraq, and I said, we have got to have a doctrinal manual. I can't believe we don't have a doctrinal manual for a war we've been engaged in for several years already, that being in the case of Iraq. And so I had this unique experience where we developed a field manual. We did it in less than a year. It's never been done in the Army in history. Normally, there's all kinds of arguments. I was empowered by the Chief of Staff. In fact, I asked him for guidance, said, Chief, I'm on my way to Fort Leavenworth, although you're responsible for 15 different centers and training centers and schools throughout the Army. I said, Chief, you got any guidance for me? He said, yeah, shake up the Army, Dave. I said, I can do that, Chief, as long as you have my back. And he did. And so we ran this manual through less than a year from start to finish, and then actually got to implement it as the commander of the surge in Iraq, where, by the way, the big ideas, the surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces. It was the surge of ideas. It was the change in strategy. People talk a lot about change management. You don't get any bigger than 180 degrees change, which is exactly what we did. We completely reversed what we'd been doing for the previous year, which they kept doing, despite violence escalating to terrifying levels and the country being plunged into a true Sunni Shia civil war. So it was quite an extraordinary experience to be able to do that. Of course, we drove violence down by nearly 90% in the 19 and a half months that I was privileged to command, and it went down further over the next 3.5 years until, tragically, right after our combat forces left, the Prime Minister of Iraq pursued highly sectarian initiatives that caused major demonstrations in the Sunni Arab community, tore the fabric that we'd put back together, the fabric of society. Then they took their eye off the Islamic State, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq previously, that we had destroyed during the surge, and it was able to reconstitute. By the way, there's a huge lesson when we get to Israel and Hamas, that it's not enough to just destroy a terrorist group. You have to ensure that it can never reconstitute. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure.
Could I just add that I thought one of the most interesting things when I read the 2006 counterinsurgency manual that David co-wrote, was how much history there was in it. In particular, I know there were lots of other campaigns, but in particular two that the British Empire fought, or at least the British Commonwealth fought. One, the Malayan emergency of 1952 to 60, where Sir Gerald Templar successfully put down a long-running communist insurgency. He was the guy who coined the phrase hearts and minds. And he projected a very positive image of what Malaya would look like, independent apart from everything else, which happened in 1957, if they defeated the communists. And then shortly afterwards, in the late 1960s and early 70s, in Oman, the Dhofar uprising, which again, a communist uprising against the Sultan of Oman, who helped by the British Brigadier Sir John Akehurst, managed again to put a positive message to the people about progress and modernity that really resonated with the people there. And David picked up on both of those campaigns, the successful campaigns, and incorporated them into the message of the 2006 counterinsurgency manual.
What's important about Oman is, number one, you have a very, very skilled sultan. By the way, he was also a very, very young sultan. He went to the British Military Academy, Sandhurst, where it seems that they apparently teach foreign students how to overthrow their fathers when they come home, which is exactly what he did. So he was in his mid-20s, he's the Sultan of, but his father,
yes,
just
his father was the classic
he
reaction.
deserved to be overthrown.
He so deserved to be overthrown. He was the classic reactionary. So he banned various things, including trousers, gas cookers, dolls, dancing, any form of
Transistor radios.
Transistor radios. What was all that about? Anyway,
Yes.
transistor radios and lots of advances in the medical, agricultural, let alone political spheres.
So the son overthrows him. He becomes the Sultan. He's very enlightened. By the way, years later, he really was a bit of a mentor for me. We would have these long meetings, and I treasured every single one of them because he was a truly wise. I used to think that he was the Lee Kuan Yew of the Middle East, and he really was in many respects. And then he had this great brigadier, John Akers, who just got this stuff as well. And the combination of a real civil military counterinsurgency campaign, a vision for the people to, again, counter that put forward by the insurgents, the communists, the Dhofar, who were rebelling against the royal family and so forth. So it was very, very instructive, actually, in each of these cases. Obviously, the reference to hearts and minds really resonates. But years later, I was writing speeches for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the NATO commander, and lo and behold, who shows up as the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander? None other than General Sir John Akers. And I took my dog-eared copy of his delightfully titled book. Only a Brit could write a book with this title. We Won a War. You know, my West Point classmates would, laugh me off the stage if I did something like that. But he did, and he made it to 4 stars, and I took it and he very kindly inscribed it. But thinking ahead now again to Israel and Hamas, this underscores the importance of the vision for the people. And as some of you may have seen, I've said on CNN or Fox or the others, this can't just be about destroying Hamas, although I do tend to believe that needs to be done given the horrible, unspeakable, barbaric actions that they took. Again, this is the equivalent per capita. We lost nearly 3,000 in 9/11. 7/10, they lost the equivalent of over 50,000, again, per capita, and had about 7,000 taken hostage. And those numbers each keep growing. Per capita, it was 200 and now up to 10 or 20. So again, absolutely horrific. And I do believe that an organization whose founding documents call for the destruction of your country and killing as many Jews as they can is not necessarily a great negotiating partner. Unlike, say, Egypt during the 73 war. In fact, we had Henry Kissinger came to one of the lunches that we did in New York, and reminded us that he could make basically he could call 4 people or shuttle around and see 4 people and get a deal done. And these people were, of course, Golda Meir, the prime minister of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, who wanted to reach a peace agreement that would normalize relations and has stood the test of time ever since, Hafiz al-Assad in Damascus, and then King Hussein in Jordan. You can't negotiate, I don't think, with a group that has done to your people, innocent civilians, what Hamas has done. But there has to be a distinction between the Palestinian people and Hamas. It has to be very clear. There has to be a commitment to them. There should be a vision for them, as we did to the Sunni Arabs when we were trying to strip them away from al-Qaeda in Iraq. We said, life is going to be much better. Here is explicitly what we're going to do for you if you will stop supporting tacitly or actively al-Qaeda in Iraq. And we did. So there has to be a vision for the future of Gaza for the people. Once you extirpate, as Lord Roberts puts it, destroy Hamas. But I believe there should also be a vision for the Palestinians in the West Bank as well. That's another one of the challenges that you have here. And the big idea that is lacking so far, obviously, it's not just about taking down Hamas, destroying Hamas, you've got to have, again, who's going to take it over. We learned this the hard way. 2 episodes when I was a division commander during the fight to Baghdad, commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division. We took the first large city, liberated the first large city in Iraq, Najaf, the holiest city in Shia Islam. 3 days of tough fighting, all 3 brigades involved. And all of a sudden the enemy collapsed. I remember calling my boss and telling him we had good news and bad news. So the good news is that we own Najaf, first major city liberated. He asked, what's the bad news? We own Najaf. What do you want us to do with it? And he said, call those guys that I had asked down in Kuwait. I said, excuse me, to the Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. I said, could you give us a little more detail on what happens after we get to Baghdad and take down the regime? And they said, yeah, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad. We'll take it from there. That was, to say that the post-conflict planning in Iraq was inadequate would be a bit of an understatement. And we have to ensure, and I know that Israel is very conscious of that. I know the leaders, I know the heads, chief of staff of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. I know Benny Gantz, the former chief of staff. And there's another former chief of staff that has also joined this cabinet with Prime Minister Netanyahu now. It's a very, very challenging problem to figure out. But, you break it and you own it, because they are going to destroy not just Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, the terrorist organizations. They're also going to dismantle the Hamas political wing. So this is a very substantial challenge for what do you do? They don't want to reoccupy. That's very understandable. In fact, President Biden even cautioned them about that. I think that's the right caution. They left Gaza in 2005 for a reason, but who is going to run that country? And it's not just going to be handing out humanitarian assistance and restoring basic services and overseeing reconstruction of an enormous amount of damage and destruction that will take place, given urban fighting is so destructive. It's also going to be to ensure that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad cannot come back, because they can reconstitute. And that is what happened in Iraq when the Islamic State was able to reconstitute, and they were even worse after that. They established the first ever caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. It took the Iraqi security forces, with our help, 9 months to clear Mosul, the city in northern Iraq where our headquarters was after the fight to Baghdad when I was a 2-star, same size as Gaza City. And so this is going to be a tough, hard fight. I do believe it is one that they need to do. And I absolutely believe it's one that we should support to the maximum extent that we can.
We haven't talked this evening about Russia and Ukraine. Would you like to make some comments on that?
Well, David and I went to Kyiv 4 months ago, and then David went back 4 weeks ago speaking to President Zelensky, and we did have a lot of meetings with various ministers and generals. And the morale of Ukraine is pretty extraordinary for a country that has undergone what it has over the last 18 months. It isn't quite as buoyant as it was 4 months ago because of the stuttering of the offensive, the big counteroffensive in the south. But nonetheless, when one talks not just to the ministerial and general level, but actually all Ukrainians that you speak to, it is a universal belief that they have to continue to fight on until they expel the Russians from that 18 or 19% of the country that is presently occupied. It's very clearly, I mean, nobody denies that it's going to be an incredibly difficult thing to do, that it does depend on American and European support. They are, of course, worried that American support might terminate, and obviously equally hopeful that European support might be able to pick up the slack if that happens. But what they're not about to do is just sort of, turn over and surrender whatever the Americans or indeed the Europeans say.
I think this is as right versus wrong as we have seen certainly since the end of the Cold War. I also think so is the case of Israel and Hamas. And I think it's also a really interesting compare and contrast when it comes to strategic leadership. Yeah, President Zelensky what's the first big idea? I don't want to ride. I want ammunition. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to defend Kyiv. All males are going to stay in the country military age. And then he communicates it magnificently, not just to his own citizens, who he talks to every single night, but the legislatures of the world, the British Parliament. And in each case, it's slightly nuanced to address that particular country's citizens. The first wartime president or commander-in-chief to address both houses of the U.S. Congress since Churchill. He's also provided a brilliant example, energy, inspiration, how he spends his time. He goes to the front lines in contrast to Putin, who sits at the end of a long table with the minions way down there. They almost need a microphone to be heard. Really seriously impressive. And contrast that with Putin, who overestimated his forces' capabilities, underestimated the Ukrainian response, also clearly underestimated the US, NATO, and Western world response, perhaps with some reason. We withdrew from Afghanistan, did not have to. We had other options. I felt that would be a decision that we would regret. I hope certainly that we have, because the outcome is not just tragic and heartbreaking, it's disastrous in my view. And it was seized on by President Xi as he said, see, you can't count on the Americans. They're an undependable partner, and look how it went. They're a great power in decline. I think we have exercised very impressive leadership in responding to Russia. I wish we'd made certain decisions more rapidly that would have gotten some key capabilities into their hands for the summer offensive, but did not. But by and large, I think that we have done that quite well. We've kept Putin from driving a wedge between North America and Europe, between certain European countries. And, he set out to make Russia great again. What he's really achieved is to make NATO great again. 2 additional countries. One has already joined, Finland, the most important, very capable forces, by the way. Finland and Sweden had forces in the coalition in Afghanistan, and they were superb. Sweden will join shortly. There's one more country, Turkey, as you may have seen, finally acceded today, and Hungary will be the last one to do that. So again, a really interesting case. Certainly after some very impressive victories, let's not forget the Ukrainians won the most important battle, Kyiv, because Russia wanted to take Kyiv, topple the government, replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure, and go home to a victory parade. Also Sumy and Chernihiv, 2 other cities in the northeast, Kharkiv and Kharkiv Oblast or province, Dnipro, or the troops west of the Dnipro River and Kherson. And they've made solid gains this summer, but not what we certainly had hoped they could, where they could cut the line of communication that comes from Russia across the southeastern coast. And they've also done a lot of damage to the logistics facilities in Crimea, even using maritime drones so effectively that the Russians have had to withdraw the Black Sea Fleet from the port of Sevastopol, which is how we learned how to pronounce Sevastopol. So again, and I strongly feel that this is very much in our national interest. I hope that Congress can, elect a speaker, get on with providing substantial additional support for Ukraine, also obviously now for Israel, for Taiwan while we're at our southern border, and maybe even for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which has run out of money as well in a time of enormous hurricanes and wildfires. So I think by and large that we have done this effectively so far. But another theme that comes out of the book is that everything in the world is connected. And if you're worried about ensuring very solid deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, noting that deterrence is a factor of a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other, you've got to ensure that both of those are solid. And if you have a red line that turns out not to be a red line, if you don't respond forcefully, or not forcefully, firmly, to, say, the occupation of Crimea and support for the separatists in Southeast Ukraine, as was the case back in 2014, that all reverberates out there. And I remember actually the prime minister of a major Southeast Asian country telling me one time, General, that stuff has an effect out here. It reverberates. And you've got to be conscious of that. And I think Ukraine and our willingness to support it is very central to that.
Your book also talks about the future of war and touches on some of the new technologies, drones, hypersonic weapons, AI. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, we very much, the chapter 10 of the book is entitled The Future of War. As you say, drones, supersonic AI, but also cyber is very important, robotics, the whole area of space, and the disinformation and misinformation, the way in which deep fakes can be used and bots and so on, which can be tremendously important when it comes to morale. And one of the major themes of our book is how important it is to keep morale up, not just in the army, but also in the nation, the wider nation. And so when we look at the future of war, it's not going to be just sort of Ukraine again, because NATO has weaponry that Ukraine doesn't have. But Ukraine does show some hints and signposts towards future war. And the key one, I think, with regard to Ukraine is this extraordinary capacity for the internet to infuse the battlefield. Don't you think, David?
Very much so, yeah. There's some really stunning developments that we've seen. Again, Ukraine is the great Max Boot, the Washington Post columnist, I thought captures Ukraine beautifully, where he describes it as All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner. So you have World War I like trenches and wire and all that. World War II sort of minefields, tanks. Cold War era. I mean, the same tanks that we were prepared to fight the Warsaw Pact when I was, say, a brigade operations officer in Germany, they're on this battlefield. It's Abrams, Bradley fighting vehicles, Leopard, German Leopards. It's on the other side, the T-62s, T-64, T-72, T-80s. There are some newer ones, but those have mostly been destroyed. So it has all of this legacy, but then you have the rapid advance, especially on the Ukrainian side, of the use of suicide drones, suicide maritime drones, very, very impressive leaps forward there. And then the context in which this plays out is stunning as well. We've never had a war in which there has been the transparency that you see in Ukraine and that we also see right now, obviously, in Gaza. And that has a lot of implications. Even when I was commanding, say, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had media monitoring, but we could monitor the TV channels, the print media, radio, and we monitored every one of those because this is like a political campaign. If they say something, you have to answer it if it is inaccurate. Our big idea for dealing with the press was to be first, beat the bad guys to the headline with the truth. And I said, we're not putting lipstick on pigs anymore. If it's a tough day, we're going to go out and say that's what it was, and we're not going to try to spin our way out of that kind of situation, which had undermined our credibility prior to the surge. So in Ukraine, everybody's got a smartphone. They can take videos and images. They can upload them. They have access to the internet. And then there's innumerable social media platforms and all the rest of that onto which they can upload this. And then mining that becomes a very substantial task. Open source intelligence is advanced dramatically. But what this means is that that media monitoring piece becomes really seriously difficult. But you have to answer it, just as we saw the other day, the disinformation that was put out by Hamas about the bombing of a hospital where they said that 500 innocent Palestinians were killed. Number one, it turned out to be about 20 or so. But number two, it wasn't an Israeli bomb. It was an Islamic Jihad rocket that didn't make it all the way into Israel and landed on the hospital. And you can prove it because they have you have so much intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance information, and they had to disclose that they could show the tracks of the rockets on what's called a counterfire radar that we provided to Israel, Q-36 or Q-37. and you can track it. You can rewind the tape essentially, and you can rewind full motion video, which they did as well. There's other systems that they can say with real certainty, this was not, and plus, you know, your aircraft, whether they've dropped ordnance or not, and if so, where did they do it, and so forth. So yet that disinformation immediately caught hold in the countries in that region in particular, but also to some degree in our own cities. Everyone seized on it. Everyone blamed Israel before they even had the facts. And it's very hard to unwind that. We haven't been able to unwind it, I don't think. So this is yet another challenge of today's battlefield. One other, what we need to do, by the way, in our country in particular, and other Western countries, is begin to transform our forces at a much more rapid pace from a small number of large platforms, however incredibly capable and exquisite they may be, also very expensive, but also very vulnerable, because the old Cold War adage that we could never actually operationalize then, what can be seen can be hit, what can be hit can be killed. You can do that now, and especially in the Indo-Pacific, you can see everything. So you have to transform from that to a much, much larger number of unmanned, smaller platforms that increasingly will not be remotely piloted. They're going to be algorithmically piloted. So the human in the loop is going to become the human on the loop, the human who actually writes the software program with the conditions that the machine must meet before it takes a kinetic or non-kinetic act. And by the way, the human's got to get out of the loop, because if you're fighting machine on machine, which is going to be some of the future of warfare, still will need soldiers without question, but the future is going to be increasingly machine on machine. Your machine's going to lose if there's a human in the loop, because the other machine's going to be faster. Yeah, I know it's scary, but that's, you know,
very scary.
As we used to say at the CIA, by the way, thanks for your 30 years.
Thank you.
There, really distinguished service as a clandestine services officer. But as we fondly would say, you have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be.
We have a question pertaining to technological development, and it's from a student in the audience. How can technological development ensure that the future of warfare results in less human suffering? And on the contrary, how could it result in more destruction?
I don't think historically you can work that out, that you can take it for granted that technology is going to lead to less human suffering. I think even long before the invention of the machine gun, which of course in the 20th century was the single weapon that increased fatality. But even before that, every major advance seems to have increased human suffering of soldiers on battlefields. One interesting thing, of course, is that, and we go into this in the book, in the first chapter of the book, is that although nuclear weapons were created, of course, in the mid-1940s, they haven't been used since the mid-1940s. You get occasionally speeches by Sergei Lavrov and Putin essentially saber-rattling about nuclear war. But all of the wars that have taken place, those 140 wars that I mentioned earlier, have taken place over the last 3/4 of a century under that level of the nuclear umbrella, which would ultimately, if it ever was, you know, nuclear weapons were unleashed, would be utterly catastrophic for mankind. So there isn't any, I don't think, a part of the human condition, part of who we are as human beings. There's nothing that says that new technology is going to lessen the pain and destruction and horror of war.
I will submit, though, that precision munitions can make, obviously, much more precise the strikes. And then it really comes down to the rules of engagement that essentially govern how you employ the weapon systems that you have. And in the West, we work very hard to adhere to the Geneva Convention, the rules of laws of land warfare. The Russians certainly do not. we've made mistakes, and we recount some of those in the book. But when we made mistakes, we acknowledged them, we made amends for them if that was appropriate, we tried to learn from them, and we took action to mitigate the chances of them happening again. And again, precision munitions were very, very helpful in that regard. I also brought over as the commander in Afghanistan, where we were constantly concerned about innocent civilian casualties, that I brought over a team from Harvard to actually look at civilian casualties in a very rigorous manner, and also welcomed the International Red Cross to examine that, and opened all of our books to them. So very collaborative and open, and also, for what it's worth, opened all of our detainee facilities we should be proud of what it is that we're doing. We are adhering to the rules, again, the laws of land warfare. We have nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, we have everything to be proud of in those cases. And so we did that. But at the end of the day, as we're going to see in Gaza, in urban combat in particular, the damage and destruction inevitably is going to be very substantial. The casualties on the Israeli side will be very significant. Innocent civilian loss of life is absolutely inevitable. It's already taking place. I do think it's incumbent on Israel to provide as much humanitarian assistance as possible that can get in and actually get to the people, not be siphoned off by Hamas to use for their terrorist war machine. And again, they're going to, this is the most difficult context. We think that Gaza is the most fiendishly challenging, difficult set of circumstances of any of the battles, if you will, that we recount. And we did plenty of urban operations when I was commanding the surge. We did Fallujah, got it right, by the way, Ramadi, parts of Baghdad, Mosul, Samarra, on and on. And these are really hard fights.
We have a question about intelligence failure. What is your opinion why Mossad and Israeli intelligence services failed to discover the October 7th attack from Hamas? Did the CIA fail? Was it a data or an analytic failure?
I think it was a failure in a number of different ways. One might have actually been something that we suffered from prior to 9/11, which was a failure of imagination. No one could imagine that people could actually go to flight schools, then get on a plane, then get their way into a cockpit, and then have the skill, or evil, malevolent skill, to fly those into the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon, and the other one was presumably heading to the U.S. Capitol. So you have that. I think the bigger issue, and by the way, it's really Shin Bet, as you know, the internal service is the one that focuses on Gaza and the West Bank, that's treated as an internal. And they're spectacular. I love Shin Bet. I love Mossad, obviously, and the stuff that we did was, according to the New York Times, was quite diabolically clever. I can't comment on whether Stuxnet was real or whatever, but Shin Bet is the one, and they're normally upstream, is the way you describe it in the intelligence world. They can actually see something. They can see someone dreaming of something, thinking of something, certainly planning it before it actually happens. And they often, especially in the West Bank in the past, have been able to stop it, to prevent it from happening because of the knowledge that they had. In this case, I think they got distracted. They were focused more on the West Bank. They were relying very heavily on surveillance devices and the billion-dollar fence. The internal disputes that were going on were very, very substantial. Those had security risks associated with them. I mean, if there's a crowd of 500,000 people marching on a particular facility or the prime minister's house or something like that, that is a concern. And it's not just the police, intelligence is involved in that. Certainly Mossad might have picked up some of the stuff that but we've always known Iran funds Hamas, equips them. The same with Hezbollah, same with Shia militia in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen. And then I think the creativity of the Hamas terrorist elements, and they dramatically improved their operational security. I think they must have come to realize what are the sources and methods on which Shin Bet, Mossad, also Unit 8200, that's the military equivalent of NSA, and even defense intelligence. What do they rely on? And not only did they dramatically reduce what was being gleaned from those sources and methods, they reportedly also inserted into those channels disinformation that everything's really going great. We're really happy that they have more work visas to go into Israel. No plans to do something like this and upset what is a pretty good situation for the citizens of Gaza. And then finally, the creativity of the actual plan and the ability to actually make that plan, train and equip those forces, position them, rehearse them, and then launch it without the Israelis knowing is quite stunning. Of course, it also took place on Shabbat, and it took place on a religious observance that coincided with Shabbat, which had a number of the soldiers on leave. So you also had a military readiness failure. The response times were wholly inadequate, as we have seen. So as always, there's typically no one single factor, as there was in the 9/11 failure. It's a number of different factors, and those, I think, are the most important ones.
I have one last question. Why should someone study military history?
I can think of no better historian to answer that question than Lord Roberts of Belgravia, who has written this as his 20th.
Yeah, my 20th book. Yes, exactly. I always feel like saying, hands up who asked that question. Because frankly, of course, you must study military history, not just to keep me in a job. The point is that again and again, and you can see very much from our chapters of our, the reason that we've chosen lots of the is because of the lessons you learn. And sometimes people learn the lessons, and very often people don't. The way in which war is not linear, that it doesn't go naturally as you'd expect it to from one lesson to the next, is in itself an important lesson of history. The Iran-Iraq War, for example, nearly 2 million people died. And there was a really, essentially a throwback that takes us back to the First World War with lots of issues regarding the way that war was fought. Excuse me. With barbed wire and trenches and gas and so on. And so again and again, it's fascinating. It's vital. It's really important to learn military history, because both from the times and the battles and the wars and the campaigns that we do learn from, but also the ones, as David was mentioning earlier, that we don't learn from. And so it seems to me an absolute prerequisite for future wars that we learn from the past ones.
Let me offer 3 quotes, and you might have to help me get these right, but because I was just dredging up. Santayana said, "Those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it," or something along those lines.
Those who fail to learn from lessons of history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of.
And then there's one, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And
there's also another one. There's also another one, David, that says that history doesn't repeat itself, but historians repeat each other.
By the way, just another very quick aside. So we went to a lunch in London hosted by a bunch of his fellow historians, at which, by the way, we learned from one of them that this is the history book of the year. Not announced yet, but it's coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And the host actually said, "Now, General, I'm sure you've experienced this special relationship, and it is very special between the U.S. and the U.K., between our militaries, our intelligence services, our NSA equivalents, and so forth." He said, "There's also another special relationship that we're going to acquaint you with, and that is the special relationship between historians and alcohol." And he proceeded to demonstrate that before us. The final comment, though, when it comes to, I am a huge believer in the value of studying history. As you have heard, we went back to review it all and to glean the lessons from it that were appropriate for today in the counterinsurgency field manual. And it was very, very helpful. But you do also have to recognize that history can actually obfuscate as well as illuminate. And so you have to be a very careful user of history. But that said, I firmly believe in the value of it. And that's why it's so great to be here with all of you who apparently seem to feel the same way, or you'd be at the Phillies game tonight. Thank you so much.
Professor Andrews, General Petraeus, Ms. Flynn, thank you so much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank them.